Lars wasn't a man easily shaken. As the village undertaker, he had seen his fair share of death, loss, and grief. In a small, remote village tucked away in the Norwegian countryside, death was as much a part of life as the harsh winters and the short, fleeting summers. But today, something felt different. Something was wrong. It was early morning when he arrived at the graveyard, a light mist curling around the headstones, dew clinging to the uncut grass. The sky was a dull gray, typical for the time of year, and the wind carried a chill that seeped into Lars's bones. He had come to check on the graves after the recent storm, expecting nothing more than a few fallen branches or loose earth. But then he saw it. Bjorn's grave, the one he had buried barely a month ago, was disturbed. The earth had been violently churned, dirt flung in every direction, as if something or someone had dug its way out. Lars froze, his breath catching in his throat. The coffin's lid was splintered, cracked open from the inside, the wood jagged and raw. For a moment, Lars didn't move. His heart hammered in his chest, and his mind raced to find a logical explanation. Wild animals, maybe? But no, the grave had been too deep, the coffin too solid for that. A prank? But who would desecrate a grave, especially Bjorn's? Summoning his courage, Lars crouched down and peered into the open coffin. The body inside was in a state far worse than decay should allow. Bjorn's once peaceful face was contorted, as though he had fought something in his final moments, and his limbs, twisted, broken, looked like they had been gnawed upon. Lars could feel the bile rise in his throat, the smell of death overpowering. But there was something else, something darker, fouler than the usual stench of the dead. A smell that clung to the air like rot, but older, more ancient. The stories from his childhood flooded back to him. The tales his father had told around the fire, stories of the Draugr, undead spirits who rose from their graves to haunt the living. He had always dismissed them as folklore, tales to scare children into behaving. Now, standing over the mutilated body of Bjorn, Lars wasn't so sure. His hands trembled as he straightened up, eyes scanning the graveyard, half expecting to see something moving among the headstones. But everything was still, too still. He stumbled back, the weight of dread heavy on his chest. This wasn't the work of animals or vandals. Something had risen from that grave, and it wasn't finished. Lars could feel it in his bones. This was just the beginning. The smell lingered, like a sickness that refused to leave. Lars had thought it would pass after he left the graveyard, after he turned his back on the disturbed earth and the broken coffin. But the stench of decay clung to him, as if something had followed him home. He scrubbed his hands furiously at the small wash basin in his cabin, the rough bar of soap barely producing any lather. He could still smell it, rot, foul and heavy, creeping into his clothes, his skin, his hair. It was the kind of smell that made your stomach turn and your body itch, the kind that seemed to crawl into your nose and refuse to let go. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the bare branches scrape against the windows like skeletal fingers. The gray sky had given way to a deeper gloom, thick clouds heavy with the promise of more rain. Lars glanced around his small cabin, usually so comforting in its simplicity. The wooden walls, the small stone fireplace, the table cluttered with books and tools. His life as the village undertaker had always been solitary but peaceful. Now the space felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. He threw the towel down and stepped outside, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. But the smell followed him, lingering just behind him like a shadow. It wasn't just the grave anymore. There was something more. Something foul had awakened, and no matter how much he scrubbed or how deeply he breathed, he couldn't shake it. The village lay quiet at this time of day. No one worked in the fields now, not with winter coming and the frost biting at the soil. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, and the faint sounds of distant hammering drifted from the blacksmith's shop. Yet there was an eerie stillness that hung over the place, something he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps it was the storm that had unsettled everyone, or perhaps it was just him, his own paranoia gnawing at his nerves. Lars moved around the side of his cabin, looking toward the forest beyond. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their tops swaying gently in the wind. He felt a presence, something lurking just out of sight, watching him from the cover of the trees. His dog Kjetil sniffed the air uneasily, whining as he edged closer to Lars's leg. "You smell it too, don't you?" Lars muttered, rubbing the dog's head absently. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rot wasn't just in the graveyard. It was spreading, seeping into the village, into his home, into his very skin. It was as if the earth itself was tainted, poisoned by whatever had disturbed Bjorn's grave. Whatever it wasn't done with him. Not yet. And as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something unnatural, Lars knew, deep down, that it was only going to get worse. The village tavern was always a warm, bustling place, even in the colder months. It was where the men gathered after a long day's work, where stories were shared over mugs of ale, and where the old-timers spun their yarns about days long past. But today the usual hum of conversation was subdued, the air thick with an undercurrent of unease. Lars pushed open the heavy wooden door, a gust of cold air following him inside. The smell of smoke and sweat mixed with the ever-present scent of old ale. But even here, in the warmth of the tavern, Lars couldn't escape the lingering stench of rot. He could still feel it clinging to him, a sickly reminder of what he had seen earlier in the graveyard. As he made his way to a corner table, the room fell quiet for a moment. The villagers, always polite but distant toward Lars, watched him as he passed. Their eyes were full of something new this time, something more than the usual curiosity or wariness they felt toward the man who handled their dead. Now, there was suspicion. Old man Eirik was hunched over the bar, his gnarled hands wrapped around a mug, his voice a gravelly murmur. Lars could hear him muttering something under his breath as he spoke to the blacksmith John. John, a broad-shouldered man with a stern face, was listening intently, nodding along to whatever Eirik was saying. "They say Bjorn's grave was dug up," Lars overheard Eirik whisper. "Mangled, like some beast got to it." John frowned. "Beast, you think?" Eirik shook his head, his eyes darting toward Lars before turning back to John. "Not a beast. No animal does that to a man's body, not after it's been buried. No, this is something older, something darker." Lars felt a chill run through him. He could guess where this was going. Eirik had always been one for the old stories, the legends of the Draugr, the undead who rose from their graves to torment the living. Stories most people dismissed as nothing more than superstition. But in the quiet of the tavern, with the wind howling outside and the weight of the recent deaths hanging over them, the stories felt more real than ever. John leaned in closer to Eirik. "You think it's the Draugr?" Eirik nodded slowly. Bjorn wasn't a good man, and everyone knows it. There were grudges, scores left unsettled. They don't rest easy, those who died with a heart full of hate. Lars clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the growing knot in his stomach. the Draugr were supposed to be just myths, tales to keep children from wandering too far into the woods at night. But the sight of Bjorn's mangled body had shaken him. Could it really be something unnatural? The tavern's murmurs grew louder as the rumors spread like wildfire, passing from one table to the next. Faces turned to Lars, their expressions dark and suspicious. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Lars didn't want to believe it, but deep down, a cold realization had begun to take root. If the old stories were true, then whatever had risen from Bjorn's grave wasn't finished yet. And Lars knew, without a doubt, that it was coming for him next. The night was thick with silence, the kind of quiet that settles deep in the bones. Lars lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The smell of rot still clung to his skin, no matter how many times he washed. He had tried to push the thoughts of Bjorn's grave from his mind, but the image of the unearthed coffin, the mangled body, and the whispers of Draugr haunted him. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. Lars's dog Kjetil shifted uneasily at the foot of the bed, ears twitching as though he sensed something beyond the walls. Lars told himself it was just the wind, just the typical sounds of the countryside at night. But a knot of unease had taken hold in his gut. And then, faintly at first, came the sound. A soft thud, like a footstep outside his window. Lars froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He listened, straining to hear more, and there it was again, a slow, deliberate step. It wasn't the casual crunch of an animal moving through the woods. This was something heavier, more deliberate. Kjetil let out a low growl, his fur standing on end. Lars sat up in bed, his body tense, every instinct screaming at him to stay quiet, to not draw attention. He reached for the oil lamp on the bedside table, his fingers trembling slightly as he lit the wick. The soft glow filled the room, casting shadows that flickered and danced against the walls. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the crackling of the lamp's flame. Then came a new noise. Closer this time, a scraping, like something dragging across the wooden exterior of the cabin. Lars's heart raced as he swung his legs out of bed and moved toward the window. Kjetil following close behind, his growls growing more intense. Slowly, Lars pulled back the curtain, peering into the dark. His breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall, hunched, and unmoving, its silhouette barely visible in the dim moonlight. Lars squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure remained still, shrouded in shadow. The air around it seemed to ripple, the mist clinging to its form. He watched for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the figure to move, to approach. But it never did. It simply stood there, staring, or at least Lars felt like it was staring, through the darkness. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, but when he stepped outside, there was nothing. The figure was gone, leaving behind only the cold, heavy air and the lingering certainty that something unnatural had been watching him. Lars had always known about Ingrid. Everyone in the village did, though most preferred not to speak of her. She lived deep in the woods, beyond where most dared to venture, in a cabin that looked like it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The old woman had a reputation, a keeper of the old ways, they said. She knew things, ancient things, whispered about in hushed tones when the nights were long and cold. But today, Lars had no choice. He needed answers. The path through the woods was thick with underbrush. the trees towering overhead, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The further Lars walked, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just the cold that chilled him to the bone, it was the feeling that the forest itself was alive, watching him. The smell of rot that had clung to him since the night before seemed stronger here, heavier. He had barely slept, haunted by the image of that figure standing at the edge of the woods. He needed to know what was happening, and Ingrid was his last hope. When Lars finally reached her cabin, it was nearly dusk. The wooden structure looked as though it had been grown out of the earth itself, moss and vines clinging to its roof, the windows fogged with years of neglect. Lars hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the rough wood, unsure whether to knock or turn back. Before he could make up his mind, the door creaked open, revealing Ingrid standing in the doorway. She was smaller than he remembered, her back hunched with age, her hair a wild tangle of gray. Her eyes, though, they were sharp, piercing, as if they could see straight through him. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice low and gravelly, with the weight of someone who had lived far too many years. She stepped aside, gesturing for Lars to enter. Inside, the cabin was dark and cramped, cluttered with strange objects. Bundles of dried herbs, old books, and jars filled with things Lars didn't want to identify. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Ingrid sat at a small table and motioned for Lars to join her. "You've disturbed something that should have been left alone," she said, not waiting for Lars to explain why he was there. Lars felt a chill creep down his spine. "The grave? Bjorn, I didn't mean to." "The Draugr," Ingrid interrupted, her eyes locking onto his. "Once awakened, they do not rest until they've claimed what they're owed." Lars swallowed hard. "How do I stop it?" Ingrid's face darkened. "You don't. But you can try to protect yourself, though even that may not be enough." She slid a small carved rune across the table. "Keep this with you, and pray it's enough to keep the dead at bay." The atmosphere in the village had shifted, and Lars could feel it as soon as he returned from Ingrid's cabin. There was something in the air, a tension, almost palpable, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. The villagers moved about their routines, but they were quieter, more withdrawn. Eyes that used to offer casual nods of acknowledgement now darted away when they met Lars's. Conversations ceased when he entered a room, and people hurried past him with murmured excuses. It wasn't just him, though. The village itself seemed to be reacting to whatever had been disturbed. The animals were skittish. Lars had seen chickens scattering for no reason, and dogs barking at nothing but the wind. Even the livestock were affected. Several sheep had died mysteriously in their pens, and the blacksmith's prized mare had fallen ill, her once shiny coat now dull and patchy. At the general store, Lars overheard snippets of conversation. The younger villagers dismissed the recent deaths and strange occurrences as coincidences. They blamed the harsh winter approaching or the sickness that sometimes swept through the region this time of year. But the older folks, those who had lived through the worst times, whispered about darker things. Lars caught fragments of their hushed voices as they huddled by the fire, casting wary glances in his direction. "They say Bjorn's grave was found open," one of the old men muttered. "His body, twisted like he fought something in the earth." Another nodded grimly. "I heard it too, and Lars, he was the one who found it. Bad luck follows the one who disturbs the dead." The hairs on the back of Lars's neck stood on end as he walked by, pretending not to hear. He could feel their stares burn into his back as he exited the store. The rumors were spreading fast, and so was the fear. Back at the tavern that evening, the tension was even worse. The warm glow of the hearth seemed dimmer, the laughter more strained. The usual crowd was there, but they huddled together in small groups, speaking in hushed voices. Lars sat alone, nursing his drink. The weight of the rune Ingrid had given him heavy in his pocket. He could feel eyes on him, hear the whispers circulating just beyond his hearing. "They say it's the Draugr," one voice whispered, barely audible over the crackling fire. Bjorn wasn't the only one wronged in his death. Others will pay too. Lars' grip tightened around his cup. The feeling of dread that had been simmering since the graveyard was now impossible to ignore. The village was unraveling, and Lars could sense it. The sickness, the deaths, the unease, it was spreading like a sickness, and he was at the center of it all. He glanced out the window into the growing darkness. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest sound of something far more sinister, lurking beyond the edge of the village. The next morning, Lars sat at his kitchen table, staring at the papers scattered before him. The early light filtered through the small window, but it did little to ease the darkness hanging over him. His mind was racing, filled with pieces of a puzzle he was just beginning to understand. Something terrible had been set into motion, and it all pointed back to Bjorn. But there was more to the story. There had to be. Lars had heard the rumors before, whispers about Bjorn's violent temper and his grudges against certain men in the village. Bjorn had been a fisherman, a tough, brooding man who kept mostly to himself, but he had never been well liked. In fact, many villagers had reason to hold ill will against him, and he against them. It was an open secret that Bjorn had feuds with several of the village's more influential figures. But what bothered Lars most was what Ingrid had said. Something about the Draugr not resting until it had claimed what it was owed. He knew the Draugr were believed to be the spirits of those who had been wronged in life, rising from their graves to exact vengeance. Could that be it? Was Bjorn's disturbed grave just the beginning of a much larger reckoning? His gaze drifted to a dusty stack of old village records on the table. Papers he had been combing through since sunrise. His father's name kept coming up. Lars had never thought much about it. His father had passed years ago, a quiet, stern man who had kept to himself. But as he sifted through old documents and logs, Lars started to piece together a story he had never fully understood. It turned out his father had been part of a group, several men in the village, who had banded together to ruin Bjorn's reputation. It wasn't just business disputes or the occasional argument about fishing rights. They had spread lies, ensured Bjorn was shunned, made sure he lost his livelihood. Lars's father had played a central role in that, leading the effort to turn the village against Bjorn. And now it seemed Bjorn was back to settle the score. Lars's heart sank as he realized the implications. This wasn't just about Bjorn's restless spirit. It was about revenge. Revenge against those who had wronged him, and that included Lars by association. The blood of his father's sins was on his hands, whether he had known it or not. Lars pushed the papers aside and buried his face in his hands. It was all coming together, but that brought no relief. Instead, it only deepened his dread. He was caught in the middle of something ancient and terrible, something that was far from over. Bjorn hadn't just come for revenge on the village. He had come for Lars too, and Lars knew it wouldn't stop until the dead had their due. Lars didn't want to go back to the graveyard. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away, to lock himself inside his cabin and forget about the horrors lurking in the cold soil. But he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whatever was happening was building to something far worse than what he had already seen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Lars set out toward the graveyard once more. The air was thick with a heavy mist, curling through the trees and clinging to his skin like damp fingers. The path that led to the burial grounds felt longer than usual, as though the very earth was trying to hold him back. By the time he reached the graveyard, dusk had settled in, and the place was bathed in a dull gray light. The rows of headstones, once familiar to him from years of tending the dead, now seemed foreign, almost threatening. The wind rustled the bare branches overhead, but no other sound broke the eerie silence. Even the birds had gone quiet, as if they too sensed something was wrong. Lars paused at the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't been back here since he found Bjorn's disturbed grave, since he first laid eyes on the mangled corpse. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as he scanned the rows of graves, half expecting to see something moving among the stones. For a moment, there was nothing, just the mist curling through the headstones and the oppressive silence pressing down on him. But then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it, movement. His heart lurched, and he turned toward the source of the motion, eyes straining in the dim light. At first, he thought it was just the mist playing tricks on his mind. But no, something was there, something solid. A figure, hulking and twisted, was moving between the graves, its body bloated and unnatural. Lars felt his breath catch in his throat. He couldn't make out the face, but he didn't need to. He knew what it was. The Draugr. It moved slowly, its heavy limbs dragging through the dirt, its head turning slightly as if scanning the graveyard, searching. Lars felt frozen, unable to move or even breathe, as the creature wandered closer to where he stood. Its eyes, faintly glowing in the fading light, locked onto him. Panic surged through Lars. He stumbled back, his hand fumbling for the rune Ingrid had given him, though he wasn't sure what protection it could offer against something so ancient and terrible. The Draugr took another step forward, its body creaking like old wood, and Lars knew he had to act. He turned and ran, the sound of the Draugr's slow, deliberate footsteps echoing behind him. Lars ran, his feet pounding against the earth, heart racing as though it might burst from his chest. The heavy, deliberate footsteps of the Draugr followed close behind, slow but unrelenting, each thud echoing in the darkness like a drumbeat of doom. The mist had thickened, swirling around him as he plunged into the woods, branches whipping at his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees seemed to loom taller as he fled, their skeletal branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. Every shadow took on a sinister shape, every rustling leaf a reminder that something terrible was hunting him. Lars could feel the weight of the Draugr's presence pressing down on him, as if the very air had become heavy with death. His legs burned, his chest ached, but he didn't dare stop. He glanced over his shoulder, just for a second, and his stomach lurched at what he saw. The Draugr was closer than he'd thought, its massive, decayed body lumbering through the mist, its eyes glowing faintly like embers in the dark. It moved with a slow, purposeful gait, but its presence seemed to warp the world around it. Time itself felt twisted, stretched. No matter how fast Lars ran, the creature kept closing in, step by step, as if nothing in the living world could slow its advance. A low, guttural sound escaped the Draugr's throat, a noise that sent chills racing down Lars's spine. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was more like the sound of wind through a crypt, an ancient exhalation of pure malice. The trees around him shuddered, as if even nature recoiled from the thing that pursued him. Lars's foot caught on a root, and he stumbled, falling hard onto the ground. Pain shot through his leg as he scrambled to get up, dirt and leaves clinging to his clothes. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds except for the relentless footsteps behind him. They were closer now, so close he could feel the cold breath of death on his skin. With a surge of adrenaline, Lars pushed himself up and limped forward, every step agonizing. He could hear the Draugr behind him, its breath rasping like dry leaves caught in the wind. The mist seemed to thicken around him, blurring his vision, but he could just make out a slope ahead, a steep hill that dropped into a gully. He had no choice. It was his only escape. Lars threw himself down the slope, tumbling head over heels through the brush. He hit the bottom hard, his body aching from the fall. Dazed, he looked up, half expecting the Draugr to be standing over him. Instead, there was only silence. The heavy footsteps had stopped, but Lars knew it was still there, waiting, watching from the mist. Lars lay at the bottom of the slope, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, his body aching from the rough tumble through the underbrush. For a moment, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing and the eerie silence that had fallen over the woods. The cold dampness of the earth seeped through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. He dared not move. Not yet. The mist swirled around him, thick and suffocating, but the heavy footsteps had ceased. Had he escaped? Was the Draugr still somewhere up there, lurking in the mist, waiting for him to make a sound? Lars strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, any sound that might betray the creature's presence. But there was nothing. The oppressive silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Slowly, Lars pushed himself to his knees, wincing as pain shot through his leg. The fall had battered him, but nothing was broken. He scanned the slope above him, his eyes searching for any sign of the hulking, twisted figure. The mist hung heavy in the air, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, just beyond the edge of his vision. His hand instinctively reached for the rune Ingrid had given him, the small carved charm that was supposed to offer protection. He clutched it tightly, hoping against hope that it would be enough to keep the Draugr at bay. But doubt gnawed at him. Could anything truly stop a creature as ancient and vengeful as the Draugr? As Lars stood, the world seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the mist thickening even more, and then, without warning, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. The grip was ice cold, the fingers impossibly strong, digging into his flesh with the force of death itself. Lars froze, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't need to turn around to know what was behind him. He could feel the weight of its presence, the coldness that seemed to drain the very life from him. The Draugr had found him. Panic surged through Lars, but his body refused to move. The grip tightened, and he felt an unnatural cold spread through his shoulder, like ice creeping into his bones. His mind screamed at him to run, to break free, but it was as if the Draugr's touch had rooted him to the spot, paralyzing him with its deadly grasp. He could hear it now, the ragged, deathly breathing behind him, the the sound of something ancient and rotting, so close he could feel its cold breath on the back of his neck. Lars swallowed hard, his throat dry. He forced his hand to move, fumbling with the rune in his pocket. But before he could pull it out, the Draugr leaned closer, and Lars felt the weight of its presence crushing him, stealing the breath from his lungs. In the next instant, everything went black. The last thing Lars heard was his own name, whispered in the dead, hollow voice of the Draugr.